Integral Theories, Philosophies and Practices, Jean Gebser Part 2. So we started to explore last time the concept of structures of consciousness as expressed by Jean Gebser in his masterwork and magnum opus, The Ever-Present Origin. We started using the tools of the rational era of the mental structure of consciousness that help us analyze what something can be out of analyzing the origins, the roots, and the meanings of the component parts. So structure of consciousness, obviously, to elucidate what the meaning can be, we had to define or to clarify what a structure could be and what consciousness could be, and eventually the link between both. Structure brought us to the field of construction, building structures, and consciousness brought us to the etymological roots in Latin of conscere, meaning knowing with. And we explored the various things that we needed to know something, which could be rendered by a simple formula of a language, so that there is knowledge of something. I need a knower, I need a knowing, a verb, an activity related to this appropriation of information, and I need an object, and eventually a context, a place, time, and so on, or means to do that. So that brought us ever so slightly closer into the realm of Gebser. And at the end of the last video, I started to evoke the fact that you find in many integral works inspired by Gebser, especially in the works inspired later by Ken Wilber, for instance, you find references to structure of consciousness, to states of consciousness, to levels of consciousness, more aptly named maybe narrative structures, and eventually to layers of consciousness, reference to the unconscious, the subconscious, and even to the things that could be the supraconscious. There are links between states and structures and the narratives that sort of explain or make sense of what's known or what's felt, what's discovered through the states and structures. So states of consciousness, as we saw last time, are most of the time rendered in some Buddhist or Hinduist practices in the fourfold or fivefold, sixfold structure of describing the gross level, gross states of consciousness, then subtle states of consciousness, and so the gross, the subtle, the causal, then the witness state of consciousness and the non-dual. And in between, you may find various subcategories, or you'd have systems including other categories. But these are the ones most commonly used, for instance, by Gebser, and since is one of those that have had the widest reach in spreading the integral ideas. These are the ones that we'll use now. As I mentioned last time, the state of being simply awake in the normal objective world can be lived very differently according to your physical states, whether you're also physical or energetic states. So physical states, whether you have all your parts or not, if you've been amputated or lost an eye, lost an ear, whatnot, you may experience a different state of consciousness. You may experience different senses, perceive different things. And similarly, if you're tired, if you're sick, if you're poisoned, if you're sad, if you're angry, if you're obsessed with an idea, you will experience the world in a very different way, and it will affect all the capabilities of perception, all your field of awareness, and the overall felt sense of being alive. So all these could be called states of consciousness. Altered states of consciousness is a very common word we find. So the idea of altered states of consciousness refers either to the consumption of drugs, meaning some type of oftentimes poison with psychoactive effects, or some kind of substance that elicits a change in the chemistry of what we say often the brain, but like all the nervous system or all the functioning of the normal body-mind. When we go through the dream state, we can similarly see that our dreams may be affected by the same states. What we live during the day are states of anxiety, of fear, whatnot, may well find their ways into our dreams. And we could expand this idea that the dream state itself may have many different subcategories or many different altered categories. So the altered states of consciousness, I'll get back to it for a second. There's this very common use in the narratives attached to the structure of consciousness, which according to Gebser is the one still dominating today, which would be the mental, and the narratives attached to it could be called the absolutist rational. So absolute means that there is just one worldview that is right, the others are wrong, to simplify. Namely, rationality is the right doorway to the world. All the other aspects like spirituality or even physicality to some aspects would be either weaker or completely mistaken approaches. Then, when we mention altered states, this oftentimes this reference to a basic baseline of consciousness, of baseline of normality to we apply to any state due to this absolutist bias that we have. So since there is just one rational truth that may be extracted from the facts and maybe objectively proved to anyone, which is the common narrative behind the scientist or scientific idea. So the nuance between both would be that science could be thought as a reiterated question, a way of asking questions from the world and taking the answers not as absolute truths comparable to the religious truths that were that in the narrative science fought against, but as relative informations allowing for capability of explanation of the past, prediction of the future, and navigation of the present. So the difference with scientism would be that it's science not as an endeavor of reiterated constant inquiry, but as a set of answers. So the content will become more important in some ways than the process. And through this, you find something quite odd in some ways. You cannot provide answers through what they would call the scientific method, or more aptly the scientific methods. Many sciences have used many vastly different ways of inquiring into the world, and you cannot provide answers, however temporary, into realms which you cannot question. So if you cannot observe something, you cannot isolate it. You cannot identify variables that you can play with and tamper with and test, or you cannot devise experiences to elicit the answers from the natural world. Then in the realms where this is not possible, there is no possibility of any type of affirmation of science. So these are realms that are out of the scope of science by their very nature, due to the absolutist bias and to the extension of rationality not as a tool amongst others, but as an absolute. So the rationality meaning the ability or the act of cutting things into pieces, to parts, which you can weight and you can measure and compare, and then weight or proportionate to others. So this chopping down or dissection of a world is not appropriate to all aspects Your love for your children is nothing that you cannot find rational behind. So the ratio would mean that you find sort of a common denominator that allows you to compare one thing to the next and decide that one thing is of more value. The value here could be just a quantity, or it could be an order of priority, an order of importance and whatnot, or an order of quality. So there's no way for you to dissect some things into parts that are a common denominator and that would allow you to decide whether it's of more value to sell the kidneys of your kids so that you get the reward or price. If the rational would be if there was a measure to this, and if, say, the common denominator was money, which is the common denominator of the widest spread religion of the time, or widest faith, then at one point or another there would be a sufficient amount of money that could be offered that would compensate or that would match the value you assign to your kids or to your loved ones or to anything you love. This is a fairly common. In many ways we've made it true. Many people have sold the lands to which they got attached as kids, the land that made them in some ways, and the land that they inherited. And so first we appropriated the land, made it ours to sell, and then we could sell it. Or easier, even, you snatch the land of someone else, you created no bonds to it, no attachments, no connection, and then it's much easier to sell it. So we've done that. In many ways we do that. So it has been said that former generations were people who sold or starved their grandchildren to feed their children. We reached refinement in it. Maybe now we are killing or starving or enslaving even our children now, or maybe even at the time I speak, 2025, maybe we even reached a point when we are enslaving and starving ourselves to feed ourselves, and to feed not only our angry stomach or starving stomach, but to feed our addictions, artificially created needs for ever expanding amounts of useless things, or useless. All things have their use, but as Charles Eisenstein said somewhere, things that could relate to his quote would be what amount of what is dangerous to us and toxic do we need to compensate for the lack of the things we deeply need but found nowhere. what amount of tourism to compensate for the lack of adventure, what amount of pornography to compensate for the lack of love, and so on. So, in many ways, we are pushing the rational program to the end. But if we were acting rationally, according to common sense, we eventually would supposedly not be doing that. Supposedly there's no value of money that we could assign to our lives, since the loss of life is the loss of any opportunity to enjoy this money. Well, you have once again many storylines where it would be proved wrong. You could sacrifice your life for work, for a lump sum of money, whatever, so that your kids or your loved ones would inherit a sum. So, as all stories, they can show some things, but they all have their limits. But if we go back to the crux of the matter, we find ourselves using science to judge things that it has absolutely nothing to say about, just because it's out of its reach. It's completely out of its realm of inquiry. When science is used and actually reified and deified, when we use this word science, it is all the time now, it is not, we are not using science in a rational way or in a mental rational way. We're using science in the mythical or magical way. We're invoking science, or we're negotiating with the power that represents science. So that's the problems we find ourselves confronted with in this time of crisis of a rational mind, crisis of a mental structure, striving for the integral in Gebser's narrative, or facing the collapse, the breaking down that is linked with the nature of the rational, with the nature of what happens when you break down things, and eventually when you use what happens when you consider that breaking down an object or a being to know what it's made of is of more value than the proper existence of this being. In this way, we are breaking down the world, not for science, not for knowledge, although quite often it could be done. We mass slaughter animals to check a few things about the inner chemistry of living organisms. And we do this because the metrics of value that we use is only linked to this constructed narrative the science, the knowledge. The knowledge, knowing would be worth killing, or would be worth dying for. And for someone with a deep passion for something, it could make sense. But spread overall, it has very serious side effects. So now, let's get back to Gebser. Let's get back to the structures of consciousness as related to the states of consciousness. A state is a temporary, it's a temporary, and especially it's a present perception of what things are in the now. A structure is a much more long-lasting and ongoing thing. So every day I will be awakened. I will move around in the objective physical world, material world. Then I will go to sleep. Most likely I will dream, whether I remember it or not. But even if I do not dream in the night, let's say that I've daydreamed most of my day. Most of my day was not the sheer enjoyment or discovery of this amazing ever-expanding museum of pieces of art that is the material world and the sensory world. I did not drift through my day in awe and wonder at all the shapes, the smells, the textures, all these things. Most of my day was spent in a dream. In a dream of subjective veiling of what's around me that I cover with emotions, ideas, wills, memories, like automatisms. So in this way, the actual the gross state of consciousness that refers to the awakened experience of a day, and is often associated with the objective perspective, the shared and common the commonalities that are shared between beings that have more or less the same sensorium. So this awakened state is actually infused and actually nearly mostly imbued completely by the subjective. 99% of the lives we live in the modern times have nothing to do with practical or material reasons or causes or logic. They're all a dream superimposed over the material world. We're not working to provide for our bodily needs, to provide our foods or to provide shelter. We are working for money, for status. We are working for the compensation of deep judgments that we have about ourselves due to past experiences. We are working for fame, we're working for a lot of dreams, but not especially dreams in the actually beneficial sense of the word. We are laboring under delusion and for delusions. So all that to express the fact that the states of consciousness are always present and superimposed the ones on the other. There's not a single moment in time when we do not have access to the unchanging field that allows for all experience to appear. The contrasting background that make the experience of perception possible and the experience of beingness possible. So the contrast that allows for the experience of beingness is non-beingness. So it's vacuity, emptiness, relative emptiness. What is not occupied, what is not defined, what is not densified. So this is what we experience as space, as freedom, degrees of freedom, things that can change, that can move. The blank canvas on which everything can be drawn, the blank screen on which the dots of light will create the shapes we identify to characters, and the change thereof we identify as stories in a movie theater. This layer is the background layer, but this layer still means nothing if there's no perception, if there's nothing to become aware of it. So this layer, this idea of the actual witness of all the beauty or all the madness is twofold. One aspect is the projection of the movie onto the canvas, and the other is the perception of it. Both are often symbolized by the sun, by the light, hence by sight in our culture, visually slant culture. So this would still be another layer, another state of consciousness, the state of a witness, which refers to a very specific feeling of being when your focus of attention is more on this than any other layer. When I perceive things while cutting all the mental chatter and the judgments and categorization and whatnot, I get this feeling of being the witness. The things outside do not forcibly change me. When I focus on the subjectivity of things, on the inner feeling that is brought inside me or that arises inside me in interaction with the outer and inner world, inner an outer objective world, then I live in the subjective. I feel this world of the subtle. When I focus on the dense things and later on the moving things, their flows, the changes, when I focus on what seems absolute dense material solid around me, I live mostly in the growth state. I experience the growth state more. But I can be in the exact same place at the exact same time and go through all those. Right now, I just shift slightly the focus of attention, and I'm surrounded just by things. Just matter. I shift again. I'm surrounded by the meanings these things have, by the evocations they have for me, by the sensations that arise within me in interaction to them, the ideas of them, the goals I pursue and whatnot. I shift again, and there I'm focused on the emptiness in the material space, but same. Around each and every word there's a silence. Before, behind, inside, each idea, each sound, each thing, there's emptiness again and again. Relative emptiness, but emptiness still. And now I shift again. And there's just the observer. And I shift again, doing this small story that allowed us to get a feeling of the integral last time via the experiencing of the non-dual state of awareness would be I collapse all the filters, all the structures that separate the feeling of self and other, the feeling of objective, subjective, relational or relative, and so on and so forth. All the borders and definition and limits that isolate things from the other, they do not actually dissolve, which would bring us back to the archaic structure, to the primal state of void or chaos. They do not disappear, but they become transparent. The artificial layers that isolate us from otherness, from the other parts of what makes us all together a greater whole, they just fade away. Not the unicity of our essence, not our individualities are not dissolved. Like the things still exist exactly the same way they were before, but the borders become transparent to consciousness, to this light, and to this void, and to the subjective, and to the objective. All this, and to the relational, and to all other things that we could include. And they do not become transparent due to an accretion of knowledge about them. We do not need to know more about things to make them transparent to consciousness. We need to know more about them to get an objective and subjective sense of having piled more information that maybe will repeat in time and will give us ideas of what things are when they're stuck into their habits, their self-repeating cycles in time. The transparency and diaphaneity that is the integral realm for Gebser is not of that nature. It's not an accretion, an addition of things, aggregation. It is a change in the structure, the overall construction of consciousness with a big C. Not our personal consciousness only, but the overall field of, like what I referred to as the unified field of information, of the raw flow of information. All things that can form information, same as consciousness. We could go around it a bit and explore. So this is what the form, and form still would open a rabbit hole, the eidolons, the Philae, and so on, in Greek philosophy, and many the shapes, the form. Many words, many stories could be told, could be explored. But for now, let's stick to the idea that information is that which puts the form in, or that it can be that in which the form is, or that in which the form is impressed. So that in which the form is impressed would bring us to the idea of the substance, the ousia, the kora. So the clay that will receive the imprint, the track, and the impression will create the memory. All memories in some ways are tracks left by events into substrates that are of such nature that they can interact, and then they can hold this memory. I can reconstruct the shape of the paw of an animal, and I can reconstruct the actual overall idea of the animal from simply the tracks. If the track was perceived in a medium that's less dense, I could actually feel in from the track in the mud. I could feel in the track in the air and get the complete picture of the animal. And then I could go to yet another more subtle realm and get the track of the spirit of the animal, for instance. So, but the fact that a track is left does not mean that it is accessible. The same track is left on solid ground, but it's just that the amount of there's pressure applied to dense floor, not to solid ground, to rock, for instance. The thing is that according to Hooke's law, there will be no elastic there will be only elastic change. There's no plastic alteration of the substrate. The substrate is slightly compressed, then recovers right away. Or it's so dense and has such pressure that the pressure stays out and there's absolutely nothing, just slight changes in the periphery. There I would, instead of looking for something brought in, I would maybe see the track appear by something that was extracted. I would see maybe that some dust was caught by the pore and taken away. So this non-dual structure of consciousness is in the same way ever present. It's ongoing. We feel it, or we actually, it's quite interesting, we discover it in retrospect nearly all the time when we've lost it. We live it when we're fully immersed or fully in the flow of things. When we dove into the river, instead of trying to understand what's happening in the river, what is the river, instead of trying to be safe and sound and secure in our knowledge, in our position, in our mastery, we dove into the river, and there we are moved by the currents, we are shaped by the currents, we become the river. Obviously, the we should be a fish in this case, otherwise we'll have to get out quite often, which may be a good depiction of modern humanity. Our need to get out, to catch breath, and to get our footing alludes to our difficulty to actually live into the flow of things, the flow of time, of duration, as depicted by Bergson, instead of the analytical time impersonated by the clock and the tick-tack of single self-similar units. And that Bergson called this the specialized time, a time that's turned into a space made of small incremental units piled on top of the other. The lived experience of the time is not this at all, especially if you're fully immersed into something. So now we're back to this idea of the structure of consciousness that Gebser refers to as integral, which is the inclusion and integration and elucidation of all previous structures being tied to the non-dual. The non-dual being we're not two with anything. We're not one. We are not identified entirely. We are not blended. We are not dissolved. Everything is one in diversity, in its, while remaining its unique treasure, its unique gift. So now, let's explore for a bit this idea of transparency and this idea of diaphaneity. So, what another tool, common tool that I use again and again to explore what transparency and diaphaneity could be. We could go through the word, like same with elucidate, this idea that something becomes transparent and the light of consciousness goes through, or the inside is expressed into the world as much as the world is impressed into the inside without much filters. Or another way of seeing it would be, instead of light being reflected or blocked, it carries on, it carries through. So a way to explore the transparency and the diaphaneity is to look for now their opposites. So what is not transparent? And there we have words like opacity, obscurity, solidity, or maybe better words. So there's this feeling of something being an obstacle to the free distribution of light. We have obstacles, we have protections, we have layers that do not allow our inner depth to be exposed to the world, to be desiccated under the dry, like the scorching sun. By nature, by biological nature, we would be bubbles of the primal seas in the modern story, common story. We have various layers of skin, from nearly dead cells at the periphery to more and more densely protected, that protect the stratum, like the basal stratum, that recreates and allows for growth and renewal, and that is much more fragile. The same idea would appear with a tree, where the cambium is protected by the bark, for instance, or where the ground and the lower leaves, younger leaves or leaves or the saplings that have leaves that are very sensitive to light because they exist in the shadow, and they are very sensitive to very low levels of light, but at the same time they're extremely fragile to strong exposition. So the canopy is protecting these next layers, these renewals of the trees that create the canopy. So, would there be other ideas that could display a bit more of what transparency and diaphaneity could be? Transparency, transparency evokes the realm of social interactions, and there we would find words. A lack of transparency would be potentially a lack of honesty, or a lack of clarity, a lack of the will to impart to all the informations and the powers they provide that are accessible to a few. I have a way to access, say, the treasures of a company, and what I do with it, maybe I have the authority, but I do not wish to have the accountability. So I try to make sure that things are not transparent. I try to make sure that things are compartmentalized. So you have many good reasons for compartmentalizing matter, energy, and information, and lives. If you remove all borders between the parts of your body, for instance, you remove the epithelium, and the outside becomes your inside. You remove your skin, very fast you'll feel it difficult to maintain self-identity. You will be reabsorbed by the concentration and the aggregation, that center of identity at the scale of the human being is, as compared to the bacteria of the microbiota around, or even more the molecules or the viruses or whatnot. So the concentration that I am is made possible by this compartmentalization, by this isolation from the rest. These preferred links between a set of things as opposed to the links with the outside. If I completely dissolve that, I remove the skin, I remove I make the gap junctions in my stomach dysfunction, which is the common occurrence nowadays due to many chemicals. You get this leaky gut thing. You get the bacterial residue of the intestine reaching into the body, into the bloodstream. And before they do that, they come into contact with the biggest array of border defense into the body, made to prevent exactly that. So that your immune system will, in the common physiological narrative, will become inflamed, will fight back to prevent the entering of foreign material that have a potential to damage the internal system and create septicemia, for instance. So there's no, here again, we need to understand that's very, very relevant, for instance, to the spiritual work. Complete dissolution of the ego being taken as the defensive layers surrounding the identity, and shaping the identity as opposed to alterity and otherness around. If we actually dissolve it entirely, there's death not only of the ego, but the being dies. The matter cannot survive without the types of physical layers, energetic layers, and emotional layers, and so on and so forth. it is very interesting that what is the very characteristics of trauma, which would be disconnection from self, disconnection, distanciation, differentiation, dissociation, and division, for instance. These things that are identified in all of us in relation to our traumatic memories, and that become obvious when the traumas are so great that they take over the seat of consciousness. They become the primal focus of attention of the entire being. These things are also what is most necessary for survival. In the physical realm, when a threat comes, you try to distantiate yourself from it. And then you try to, if the threat is taking over, for instance, and you get say your tail was caught, you're a lizard, then you will dissociate and divide. You de-associate from a common alliance and association with a part, so that the overall can survive. Just plug a computer. So what we have with what we see, the same things that destroy us and are identified when they're in the pathological state, they are very often, if you look deeper, they are very necessary and vital things for survival. If someone is not able to differentiate his or her own life from the news, for instance, so from the stream of information that is supposed to give you an idea of what's happening in your bigger self, your world self, or your country self, or whatnot, whatever greater definition of yourself, where you're only a part, a cell, instead of being the whole. If you cannot differentiate from it, you get consumed by rage, by fear, by hatred, by whatever. You need all the time to be able to differentiate. That's one of the most common drill of, say, some types of meditation. When we consider the observer, for instance, there's this very common story about the seat of consciousness. You go to the movie theater and you're watching objectively, you're seated and you're watching a blank screen being bombarded by dots of light that create patterns that are reflected into your eyes, and they are translated into these electric signals that will recreate the appearance, like the pattern that has been seen or that has been recorded, because it's basically a track at first. It's a track of real light being reflected on a substrate that could capture it, if it's the old style movies. Otherwise it's the tracks of the AI. So when you're in the movie theater, you didn't pay to watch yourself watching a blank screen with dots of light, with other people doing exactly the same thing and having no social interaction whatsoever in the dark, with maybe a few noises of human interactions or food or drinks being spilled or swallowed. You do not pay for that. You pay for the experience of allowing your awareness to penetrate the movie, your field of attention to be grabbed, seized by these intricate patterns of lights and then of interaction between characters and the storyline, the plot, and then you dive in. You're not seated at your seat anymore, you're in the movie. What's lived by the character is directly affecting your objective physical state, your heart rate, your breathing, your hormones, and so on, your neural and nervous states, even the contraction of the muscles. You live what they live. You fall in love with fictitious characters. You're pursued, you're tracked by the aliens or monsters that are sometimes pieces of plastic moving around in an artificial background. But you live that fully, however unlikely the events presented, however poorly the rendition of the movie. Once you get into it, you're in another world. So the idea of meditation is first also one aspect of meditation, the one related to the state of consciousness of the observer, of the witness. You get back to your seat. You dissociate and you distantiate and you differentiate yourself from the screen. You step back, you broaden your horizon, and then you leave just a layer of your consciousness watching the screen and being entranced into it. Otherwise, it's better to leave the movie theater, and the rest of it is safe from, like, the vast majority of your body mind is safe from these interactions. You're mildly affected. You appreciate the story, but you're not the story. You divided yourself in this way. Now, when you're seated, you start to see that around you there are all those noises that you forgot for a while, all these people, and maybe the chair is not so comfy, maybe you do not feel so good, or maybe you feel good, but it may be warm, it may be whatever. And since you came back to what we call reality, now you're fully into the story of what's happening around you. People are bugging you, their social behaviors again, and what's happening around is directly reflected onto your physiology, onto your heart rate, onto all the things that were mentioned before, and changing your ideas, changing your emotions and whatnot. And there the story goes, you discovered another screen, and you discovered that on this screen is played yet another movie. And in the same way, you can actually be there and have all these things happening around. For as long as they do not directly touch you, they should not be you. But you get hypnotized, and then you dive in, and all that's happening around you is you now. You are rage erupting at the unruly behavior of some kids in the front row. Anything of the type. The same process happens again. You distantiate, you differentiate, you dissociate. You dissociate your perceptions from your basal physiology, your baseline physiology. And you get back inwards somehow, and you discover you are not what happens around you. It's not the world could be ending around until it actually dissolves your skin and your layers, or blows you away. The inside may still be comfortable. Now, next movie, you're inside. Yet another movie is being played. Your internal feelings, your internal sensations, your physical pains and whatnot. And this also you identify with, and this also you become. The opposite of differentiating, of dissociating. You associate, you come closer, you approach, what was the other one? Differentiate becomes you identify, and division becomes you fuse with these things. And now again, there are times when you feel bad things into your physical body inside. You can be sick, you can be hurt, but it's not always that this affects your psyche. So it means if it's not always the case that the change in one affects completely the other one, it means these things are not the same. So you are not your internal feelings in this story. And you're still watching another movie projected on another screen. And you step back, get further away, take more distance, broaden your horizon, and there it goes to your mind, to your thoughts, to your emotions, and it's replayed again, and then it goes to your awareness, to your field of attention, and there it goes again. Again and again and again and again. Without ever ending. You are not the next layer that's watching yet another movie. You are not doesn't mean that you do not contain it, but it is not your essence. And each time you make a step back, if you want to keep existing at this level, you leave a layer of your being, a layer of consciousness there. So you leave a layer of consciousness watching the movie, a layer of consciousness watching your surrounding, a layer of consciousness watching your inner feelings, a layer of consciousness watching your thoughts and emotions, a layer of consciousness watching your field of attention, then your awareness, and your consciousness, then the consciousness of your consciousness, and so on and so on. So this is a story that's used to evoke the concept of anatta in Buddhist traditions. So it's often translated as non-self, but again, it's very easy to give Buddhism a nihilistic bias by just going very shallowly about it and translating very, very inaccurately. So Anatman is not non-existence. It's not that the world is an illusion in the classical idea we would assign to it. Anatman means that there is no absolute center of beingness that can be isolated from the others. There is nowhere where you will find a stable and definitive I center. It doesn't mean that the I does not exist. All these layers exist. The movie exists because the movie exists. The external world exists. The internal feelings exist. Your ideas exist. Your emotions exist. Your field of attention exists. Your awareness exists, and so on and so on. When it is said that everything's an illusion, well, there's always this problem. Like, if everything's an illusion, then there's no contrast. The universe is illusion, and it doesn't matter. It means nothing. Illusion is just a word that has been swapped for reality. There can be illusion only if you have something you deem a reality, and a shallow impersonation of it by something, or a twist of your perception or interpretation that make you perceive something that is actually not what is there or not what is happening. So that's the illusion idea. If everything's an illusion, then illusion is the reality. It changed nothing to your definition of your world. The only change maybe that could happen, which is something I'll go into, we linked the states of consciousness and the structures of consciousness. But previously I mentioned that very often what Wilber and others call the levels of consciousness, which is a dangerous word in many ways. Dangerous word. So levels of consciousness refer to narrative structures that make sense of the lived experience in a specific state of consciousness and through overall non-personal structure of consciousness. Non-personal meaning that the structure of consciousness is more something that is primarily seen in the collective. All structures of consciousness coexist, same as the states, but one would be more expressed at a given age, at a given time, in a given culture. So in people or in the collective, one will be more often salient, and the others will be more in the background. The layers we mentioned for the consciousness, one would reach what we call consciousness and others would be subconscious, and yet others would be in the depth of the unconscious, using this iceberg model, for instance. So the iceberg, so we'll go back to it. But the narrative structures so they're directly tied to structures of consciousness. Often the names used are the names that Gebser used for the structures of consciousness, and they can describe the stories we assign and the logics we use to make sense of the world at a specific structure of consciousness or in a state of consciousness. So say I have my ordinary waking up in the morning, and then I open my eyes to a world. Obviously, if I'm lucky or unlucky, there's some continuity of experience that gets back to me through memory. I distance myself from my astral trips during the night, my dreams and so on. And I start to assign meaning to my experiences. So I get back not only to world, but I get back into a story. I get back in a movie, and the movie has sequels, or in the modern way of things, it has replays. It's the same movie remade again and again. It's the Groundhog Day, or it's a brand new day and a new adventure. What I wake up to is not only a state of consciousness, a state of health, a state of fitness, or a state of alertness, a state of awakening. It's a storyline. Who am I? What is the world? What am I doing? What will I do in the day, and what should I do, and so on and so on. And these stories, the core of it or the global theme of them, not the details, but the broad strokes and the overall narrative structure will be given by these narrative structures. Now, so now in this idea, I can live I can wake up to an undifferentiated, undefined world, so it's a sort of a primal chaos where I have all these impressions and things. I'm surrounded by all these things, but maybe the things did not change from the day prior, but the definitions are not strong, are not solid. I'll say that a very easy way to access. I take quite a load of LSD. The world dissolves back into a mix of everything, maybe. And I don't really know who I am, what's the border between self and other, what's the things, the identity I give to things, and the sort of solid definition blurs or then dissolves or shifts, and I'm back into the primal chaos. It doesn't matter that for others the experience may be very different, because for me all that I feel, all that I see is that the logic, like the structures of cause and consequence and sequels of meaningful propositions break down completely, and right away I become huge or I become nothing. If you do a bad trip, maybe you attacked or covered by spiders or whatnot, things that you dislike, and your subjective can become all this. It can be a show, and you're just enjoying the show as any other, or you can become this. If you become this, then you're lost. Then you'll have a very, very hard time. On the other end, it could have exactly the opposite effect, and it could dissolve or pause the mental chatter, like it could render transparent all the clear-cut definitions that made your world a jail, and you could burst into the integral, the non-dual, or any what's called higher states of consciousness. Higher doesn't mean better. It means that it's activating different centers of energies and for different purposes. But so you could become one with the world through this very same experience of just adding a few drops of matter to this huge amount of drops of matter that you are. So the narrative of what you're living day after day is not just based on the changes of states of consciousness, states of being or whatnot, of your states. It's also affected by the overall mental structures that make sense of the perceptions. So the language would be a layer, like all the aspects of your culture would recreate or would create a new storyline, and it has all the layers, individual layers, collective, familial, those of the species, those of the planet, whatnot. The narrative structures that are associated with various states of consciousness, and even more with the structures of consciousness, are oftentimes called either the same archaic, magical, mythical, and so on, or they can be expressed in other ways, like Wilber uses colors so that it does not directly evoke meaning. He uses color, and then there's a small problem of definition in Wilber's work, although in older work it clearly delineated the danger of confusing levels, what he calls levels, like these different structures of narrative structures of the experience, with a hierarchy of levels of betterment of consciousness. Quite often in his writings there's a blending of both. So the idea of levels of consciousness was, we see that in higher levels of consciousness. So this is tied to all the work that's been done developmental physiology, for instance, or the overall consciousness of change over time in all types of structure. And so in modern times, what's mostly referred to as the evolutionary aspect of things. That evolution implies, just in the meanings associated to words, imply a betterment oftentimes for many people, or an evaluation, even the word survival of the fittest, for instance. And fit could mean many things, like in Darwin's idea. It's not at all sure that it implies the fact that something is absolutely better than something else, which has very little meaning in actual life. But it may mean that something is more suited to the overall matrix of relationship around. So their survival of the fittest is survival of the piece that fits into the puzzle at this given time and place, that fits better. But still, all the intellectual history around it and the culture that gave rise to it and all that deeply associate these evolutionary narratives to a positive evaluation of the culture that gave rise to these ideas. So the Western industrial capitalist modern culture. Capitalist wouldn't matter, it's the same things with the materialist industrial world, scientific industrial world, deemed more advanced, more intelligent, more, in many ways, more conscious than the world of the different tribes or cultures that still existed as remnants at the turn of the 20th century, and more and more as just scattered broken pieces in some aspects, or in a completely different evaluation from the inside of these stories as adaptations and survival. So cultures adapting and surviving to the immense pressure exerted upon them by the modern era and the modern culture. But so there's, when we use levels in our world, there's very, very easily this idea of hierarchy. And in many ways, Wilber wanted to recreate this feeling that there are layers, there are levels of expertise, there are levels of abilities. He wanted to counterbalance a narrative that is a late narrative of the rational age, that is called the green narrative by Wilber, and is referred to as pluralistic, relativistic narrative structure or level of consciousness, according to the words used. So, what the preceding structure, or the overall structure in which this pluralism appears, is called the rationalist absolutist structure, and it's associated completely with the rise of science and technology as ways to command and conquer the realm of matter via technology, and the realm of ideas and the mind via science and the world of knowledge. So this impulse, which was very, very strong and growing from the reaction to the drifts, shadows and excesses of prior mythical imperialist structures. So these pluralist relativistic were similarly an answer to the drifts and shadows and biases unavoidable, inherent into the nature of things. All things have their biases, their drifts, their secondary effects, and so on. So in response to a world of broken empires fighting each other with the one true faith, the one creed that gave them the right and the ethical freedom to kill the others or burn them to the stakes or whatnot in the Middle Ages during the big fights, not like late Middle Ages, especially during like what would be the beginning of the Renaissance and the era of the religious wars between the Reformed Christians and the Catholics. So this era called many people to a quest for a way of perceiving the world that would go beyond the ideas of the creeds and faiths of the separate sides. So to reconcile sides, you would need to find a common ground and be able to extract information from this common ground that could not be that could be agreed upon very easily, because they were very obvious factual material experiences. So Descartes was in his life, he fought the 30-year war, if I remember right, and so he was exposed to the cost of these so-called religious wars, which were also not only striving for imperialism in the religious field, but also the need of expansion of unities of power, trying to reach further and further and get bigger and bigger. And so the imperial striving linked or seconded by the religious aspirations of the various camps. So from that, the need for this replacement of the what linked together people by something that could not lead them to kill each other, brought forth the idea of the need for this scientific, what we now call science, which was natural philosophies, and a common ground of experience that could not be attacked, could not be subjectively interpreted. And the quest for absolute truths in the material realm instead of absolute truth in the subjective realm, which were inaccessible to all others. You had no way of proving it apart from sheer force. So this led to a striving that that became stronger during times called the Enlightenment in France, for instance, where these ideas spread more widely and where the strong association of the political powers of the kings and aristocracy and the religious power were questioned. And over time, it brought during the 19th century, late 18th and 19th century, a slow shift in the culture, not as clear-cut as it is often depicted, because a lot of the old powers were still prevalent during the 19th century and even into the 20th century and to this day. But still you had a massive shift, massive decentralization of power in some aspects, or from the strong political structures of the aristocracy and monarchies towards the bourgeois class, bourgeoisie, and the powers of business, money, industry, and hence technology, science. This led to an era when all the discoveries in science in the 20th century and the power they gave, especially with the use of machine guns and stuff like this, explosives, cannons, boats, this power to take over and to display the superiority of your creed by sheer force allowed for the continuation of the proselytizing that had been ongoing since Christianity. But now the religion that was spread was the religions of money, trade, progress, technology, and then attached to it what they call democracy, which would be more republican structures. Like republican means not much. That's where respublica is public things, but more decentralized. So basically, the rule of the not of family lines, but of money lines. Eventually, family lines due to inheritance, but still, the rule of money over the rule of the birth or family or whatnot. This movement went maybe even further because the abilities to reach further and further became greater and greater. So it completed the imperialist colonizing of the entire world by the Western countries. And it made many smaller cultures and ways of being, ways of seeing the world and whatnot disappear or dwindle into nothingness or lose their agency and lose their ability to decide the world they lived in, or their authority over their lands or whatnot. And this impulse was pushed by the idea there is only one truth that has now been unveiled, and it is our duty and our interest to share it with the rest of the world, to take over barbarians, to bring them into civilization and things of such type. And these again mixed with former narrative structures. So the narrative structure, in much the same way as the states and as the structures of consciousness, they're coexistent. They always exist in some forms or another. There is nearly no invention in the structures, but the actual story, the content will change massively, but the overall storylines and the structure of the stories will tend to repeat, although you have collectively access to more of the time, supposedly, or to these geomorphological landscapes where the various layers that arose at different times or even at different developmental levels of the individual or of the society, for instance, different ages, different lived experiences, they rise above others in certain parts of the land, and they are submersed or they are pushed below in others, or in some they would be mixed and whatnot. So the pluralistic narrative is the answer to this uniformization and homogenization of the world that silenced a lot of the smaller voices of cultures, but also smaller voices of the people inside the countries. Like the Industrial Revolution was a hell for living beings of all types, nature, workers, whatnot, and over time you found these reactions to it. So changes in narrative structures, as we'll see later in another video mostly, same as the developmental aspects of the levels of consciousness would be, or even the narrative structures, and they are answers to drifts or to excesses or to inadaptations. We'll use the model, common model by George Land, and then sort of broadened slightly after him, of each level or could be thought of as having a phase of formation, creative exploring period, followed up by a period of normation, like more homogeneous growth. You produce just one product, but you specialize in this product, and you can get your economies of scale and whatnot in the old industrial models. And then transformation, which is a reformation. In between each, what calls for what calls for change in these phases are crises, or what Georgeland called breakpoints or turning points or whatnot. So these are the good effects of what you were doing is piling up the side effects and the biases and the drifts and the dead angles, the blind angles. And at one point these pile up so much that there's a very, very strong need or push for part of a population for a change. And this change can go different ways. It can be a transformation. You actually change the structures, so you go from something creative to something more normative and more conservative in some ways, that can grow, that doesn't change all the time. And then later you break down these very strong rigid structures to allow for recreation, for transformation, which is even more difficult. So it can allow for change, or it can do business as usual and keep piling up the problems and then wait for more and more crises, or increasing intensity and depth. Or it can actually do more of the same. So get the feeling that what we did to reach this point was do such and such. So these are good because they brought us all the good things we have now. So to get out of the bad spot we're stuck in, we just need to do more of what works. So not only business as usual, but more, pile up more. This is common narrative. We're living it right now to a very interesting extent. So this will not keep the curve, it will accelerate the downfall, because you're just piling heaps more of the same problems that brought you to this crisis, these alarm calls. And so this model could be in between. You'd have past a transformation, past a successful transformation. It could be you could reapply fractally the model, and in some ways you would have another period inside each of the beginning, then of maturity, and then of decline at the end. And they would mimic in the smaller level the creative, normative, and crisis aspects. And when past the point of transformation, oftentimes there's a place of what they call performance, like the model of Georgeland was form, norm, transform. What's been added by other efforts was storm, the crisis, and perform, like the sweet spots. Past the change, when you basically what you're doing is you're falling on one side, you recognize it, and you counterbalance by going exactly the other way. And during all the time that you're going back towards equilibrium on your bike, you're feeling that what you're doing is wonderful. Because you see only good effects, good results. So this would be the perform part. But you reach the top, you're not aware of it, and maybe very often you dismissed entirely the other side because it's what brought you down, and so you consider that it's my way or the highway. Now the highway is falling down on the highway, so you lean the other way, and at first it's very subtle. You do not really you do not pay attention to it, or you may think that it's part of the oscillations, the natural oscillations that you need to keep the bike running. But since you left only the steering wheel going one way, it can only keep increasing its drifts to the other side, and there you'll fall again, or you'll have to change. So if we apply it to the narrative structures or structures of consciousness, what happens when the absolutist rationalist structure piles up its obvious problems after the world war, the second, like the two world wars, especially after the Second World War, with the nuclear bomb, where you discover that your story of progress is not the story of the paradise where you do not have to work or anything. It's a story of potential destruction of the entire world you live in, and all that's of a sufficient complexity and size living on top of it. And this pushes those that are most oppressed to rise and express concern and express rage and try to change things, try to change the narrative of a culture. And so that's one way of seeing the rise of plurality and relativism after the Second World War showed what progress, science, technology, and this one-sided mind could bring the world. The rationality of the Nazi regime, the cold-minded organization of mass slaughter, which is seen again and again, and no new story. But it really impacted the collective psyche and pushed for something else. And this something else was what's called in the philosophical ideas, like decolonialization for politics, but in the philosophy it's the constructivist period and deconstructivist period. The idea that there's no absolute truths, the truths are culturally mediated, and just to very, very broad strokes. And so this is contradicting and breaking down the previous structure, while still being a part of the same previous narrative, while still being part of the same structure, the same mental structure, and in many ways being fed by the previous narrative. So the critics about the extremes in recent years or decades of the pluralist relativistic narrative are articulated around the fact that it perceives itself as an absolute and negates all possibilities for others to discuss or contradict it. So Wilber's take on the narrative, the green, is that it's actually attacking the integral by negating the potentiality of rising above this broken down world, like the atomized world of a plurality, and the negation of spirituality, the negation of anything beyond the actual narrative, is something that Wilber perceived as a very, very, very big problem, and over time it led him oftentimes to confuse in his work the difference between structures and levels. and the idea that the green, for instance, is better than whatever the orange or like magical structure. The same thing is expressed in his view of when he describes magic, for instance, the magical thinking of tribes or the mythical structure, like mythical narratives of religion. He didn't dwell deeply into it. He dwelled deeply into the modern era, modern psychology, many aspects, and he dwelled deeply, practiced deeply various type of Eastern meditation. But he's very lacking in acumen, or his take. So once again, it's difficult to know if it's only a way to sympathize with his time and make his work more accessible by just conveying the most commonly allowed narrative, or if it's really getting into the story and mixing the structures and the narratives with developmental levels, as though humanity would be growing up as a pre-established being, like a body that creates its developmental, that goes through its developmental process, is reproducing over and over again the same steps, and the steps correspond to pre-memorized or pre-programmed form. So this idea of the different societies, the different cultures corresponding to steps towards the manifestation of the real human society or real human being is quite problematic in many ways that we'll explore another time.